Good afternoon. Welcome to Reconciliation Ministry and National Benevolent Association's webinar, Embracing the Call. I want to introduce, as we start right away, our host, Dean Bucalis, and he will facilitate the order of our webinar today. I want to thank you all for joining us, and out front, we want to definitely thank all of our participants. Dean, thank you so much.
I want to welcome everyone to this important webinar that we are pleased to be co-sponsoring with the Reconciliation Ministries. We have some wonderful guest presenters, and I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves in just a moment. And I want to ask April to just share a little bit about the background and nature of Reconciliation Ministries and why webinars like this are so important. April?
Sorry for the delay there. I am going to introduce my colleague and the Reverend Berenice Gil-Soto, and she is going to introduce this webinar. She has been working in direct partnership with NBA to bring this together. And Bere, will you take it away?
Absolutely, thank you so much. As Dean was saying, this webinar is in partnership with the National Benevolent Association, and it comes out of the need when we were thinking and dreaming about the special offerings theme, and we came up with it to be embracing the call based on the very strong and challenging words of the prophet Micah, that it is our call of us all to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly before God. Looking at today's world and how we are living and the things that are around us, how people of color are treated day by day and mistreated. In conversation with the NBA, something that continued popping in my mind was that the first capacity, that one of the first capacities that God gave us as human beings was the ability to name things, to use our language, and the power and responsibilities that this comes with. And so that related to embracing our call to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly. The power begins with the power of our language. And today we're going to learn from experts in this field of how we can go beyond the labels that we use, how we can use the language that God Self has given us to, instead of dehumanize, to humanize again God's children. So we hope that you be challenged today, that you be encouraged today, and that everything that you hear may sit at a place that will move you forward to embrace your call. Thank you so much for this, and we hope that you enjoy it all.
Thank you, Barry. I appreciate that. I want to introduce our four panelists and in a little bit of background of who I am. I'm Reverend Dean Bucalis. I'm a minister in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ and mission specialist for the prison and jail ministries of the National Benevolent Association. We've got four outstanding folks, as I mentioned before, and I'm going to introduce them one at a time and ask them to just share a little bit about who they are and what their backgrounds are, and then we're going to get to the substance of this webinar. Deetra Baker, would you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are and
Hi, I'm Reverend Dr. Deetra Wise Baker. I'm the program coordinator for activism and advocacy for the National Benevolent Association. In the past, I've been a chaplain with youth who were incarcerated in the juvenile justice system for 14 years, working with those youth as a juvenile justice chaplain at the city, county, and state levels.
Thank you.
Judge,
I'll invite you to introduce yourself briefly. Johnny?
Yes, sorry about that. Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you to the National Benevolent Association for having me. It's really a pleasure to, bring my expertise and my experience, into this conversation. My name is Johnny Perez. I am the Director of Youth Prison Programs for the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, where I build the capacity of faith leaders around the country to have them engage in legislative advocacy around conditions of confinement, specifically solitary confinement. So I bring my professional acuity to the work and also my personal and direct experience with solitary confinement, having spent 3 years in solitary confinement. So I hope to add value to the conversation. I hope to enlighten and illuminate a lot of the atrocities that happens beyond those concrete walls. Thanks again.
Thank you. Amilcar Valencia, would you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be part of this conversation. My name is Amilcar Valencia. I live in Atlanta, Georgia, and I am the director of Refugio Ministry, which is an organization that help and support families who are, had loved ones detained at one of the immigration detention centers here in Georgia. And we have a visitation program at the detention center too. So we talk to the immigrants who are facing deportation quite often. We have a robust visitation program. So we bring people to the detention center and just so they have the opportunity to receive a friendly humanitarian visit in this environment.
Thank you. And George Chokos.
Thank you. My name is George Chochos, and currently I'm the pastoral assistant at Summerfield United Methodist Church. Formerly, I served at the Bridgeport Rescue Mission in the capacity of a program manager, where I designed their supportive housing program, especially working with the formerly incarcerated. I also serve as a reentry coach and a consultant with the Yale Prison Education Initiative that just started its first semester at a Connecticut State Prison. Prior to that, I can recall 18 years ago being sentenced to 14 years in prison. I entered prison. There were no higher education programs except for one in the infamous Sing Sing prison. That was the first jail I went to. Walked into the wrong section of the master's classroom and realized there was one program left, a master's program offered by New York Theological Seminary. Didn't know what my life was going to be like. 10 years to the day I was back in that master's classroom because Bard College had come in and started a program, earned an AA 2 BAs, got the master's degree, met somebody on Yale Divinity School's Advisory Council, was accepted into Yale University, the Master of Divinity program in 2013, graduated with honors, and I just recently completed a Master of Sacred Theology also at Yale. And finally, I just say that my transformation story comes at the expense of a lot of people's pain, and I desire to use what life I have left to be part of the solution and not part of the problem.
Thank you, George. I want to begin our discussion by just laying some groundwork and placing this into the context of what we're going to be talking about today. Mass incarceration has disproportionately affected people of color in our country for a number of years. Moreover, how we speak about and to one another really matters. The words we use, the phrases we incorporate, the language that we choose, all of these things matter. They shape our understanding and inform the way we treat one another and interact with one another. So today we've invited Johnny and Deetra and Amilcar and George to reflect on this and to share their thoughts and perspectives. And the way that we've done that is we've given each one 3 questions to ponder, the same questions, and we have asked them to give their thoughts and responses to these questions. And we're very grateful to have them join us. As you have heard, they have a wide range of experiences and a richness in the quality of their lives. So here are the three questions that we presented them with, and then we'll sit back and listen to them respond. The first question was, what has your experience been with the criminal justice or immigration detention system? The second question is, how has the use of language been used to describe you or those with whom you've worked, and how has it affected the way in which you or they have been treated? And the third question, through imagery and verbal depictions employed by the media and politicians, brown and black people have often been demonized when they've been involved with the criminal justice and immigration system. How has this informed the way in which you see yourself and others, and the way that other people interact with you? Johnny, let's start with you.
Absolutely, and those are such great, questions. I'll start with the first one. How has my experience, what has been my experience with the criminal justice system? So there are four things that really stick out for me throughout, 13 years of incarceration. At the age of 21, I was arrested and sentenced to 15 years in prison for robbery in the first degree. I robbed a convenience store to feed my family, and as a result, I found myself inside of those concrete walls. And one of the things that really stuck out for me throughout that journey, it was my time in solitary confinement. I spent a total of 3 years in solitary confinement for testing positive for marijuana throughout the time that I was there. And while I was there, I noticed that, there was little to no, mental health treatment available, anger management, substance abuse treatment, although I was there for abusing a substance. And then what really stuck out for me was, of course, the lack of human contact while we were there. You're locked in 23 hours a day, in a cell probably smaller than the average bathroom. And the first time that I touched solitary confinement was as a 16-year-old in, one of the most notorious jails that really runs as a prison in a country called Rikers Island in New York City. And very quickly I learned and saw that, these are places that were meant to dehumanize people. And not only in the environment and the architecture of the structures, but also just in the language and in the way in which people refer to me, which I'm gonna get into in a minute. And then later as an adult, again, being able to experience solitary confinement and also being released directly from solitary confinement into society. And I think Einstein said that if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, you'll fail every time. So it's no wonder that folks who have been, released directly from solitary confinement are at a higher likelihood to recidivate and come back to prison. The second thing that really sticks out for me throughout my experience of incarceration was actually discovering the transformative power of education. While I was there, just like George, I also discovered the transformative power of education, and I acquired, an associate's degree while I was there. But what really stuck out for me was that that prison had to be a place where I discovered education and not in my own community. And it's a shame that I had to go into such a dark place to find a light, if you will. But I remember very quickly, one of the things that really stuck out for me throughout that process was that although I accepted personal responsibility for my actions, there were times when people ignored, even myself, the environmental factors that played, that influenced, my decision-making at the time. And I think that also plays into the larger society, how sometimes we see someone get arrested and we blame the person, and we should hold that person accountable. But it's another thing to really look at the influence and environmental factors that played into this person's decision making. Another thing that stuck out for me, of course, was the reentry part of it all. So you do 13 years in prison from the age of 21 to 34, and then you come back into a society that has continued without you. You come back into a family that has learned to live without you. And then you learn really quickly that the consequences of having a criminal record are perpetual, and that a 15-year sentence was actually a life sentence, because everywhere that I turn, I have this blemish or this scarlet letter, that indicates that I have never been truly forgiven. And one of the ways in which that reflects itself is really in the language, which is one of the reasons why I think this webinar is so important. One of the ways in which we dehumanize people is that we take their names away. In the department, they take your name away and they give you a department identification number. In fact, it's more important than any other number that you've known in your life. But then some of the other labels, right? You're called an inmate, you're called an ex-con, you're called a jailbird. And the thinking is that we can't treat someone inhumanely unless we dehumanize them. And one of the ways in which we do that is that we dehumanize them with the language. So how does that look like in practice? You know, so there are things that I can do to an inmate or ex-con or a criminal, if you will, that I can't do to somebody's daughter or somebody's son or somebody's grandfather, although those can be one and the same. And, you know, the connection between how we, you know, how we perceive people, the connection between language, perception, and then ultimately how we treat people, you know, and then more importantly, you know, how we treat people says more about us than it says about them. You know, and unfortunately, we live in a country which is not, which our criminal justice system or criminal legal system, I should say, is not representative of our shared values. You know, the way in which, you know, the language has shaped my work and, you know, the way that I view myself and view others, you know, and even in the media to the last question, you know, how folks are demonized, you know, is that, you know, this language has a power to kind of shape some narrative about who we, and I say we as far as people who've been impacted by the criminal punishment system, how we're perceived, you know, and more importantly, you know, the language also perpetuates those consequences. So part of my work is actually to counter those narratives and to take that power back and create our own narratives about who it is that we are, how it is that, you know, what is the type of change that we wish to see, and more importantly, how does a humane, you know, accountability system look like? You know, we can hold people accountable for their actions without having to treat them inhumanely in the process of holding them accountable. You know, and you know, I hope to kind of expand a little bit more on that now, moving forward. But I'm going to stop there. You know, and I'm going to actually pass the ball over to Deidre, or who, you know, mentioned before, she is with the NBA Activism Advocacy Coordinator. So thank you a lot for letting me share.
Thanks, Johnny. You put up so many amazing points for us to go deeper in. I mean, I would say, you know, the perspective that I want to introduce on the call is that of the younger people that are connected to the system, and the language and the narratives that are created about them and their families and the environments that they come from. As a juvenile chaplain for 14 years, I mean, I had to go through my own conversion, and I would say I'm still going through that conversion, coming in as a person of faith. And you know, my story is, you know, I thought, oh, I'm gonna come in and I'm gonna save these bad kids, and, you know, give them religion and transform them so that they'll be better and won't go back out and do the bad things that bad kids do. And one of the things I began to realize quite quickly is that God was really up to my own transformation in that space, and that these kids were just regular kids. They're just normal, regular kids. And there's something about these systems, you know, the form of dehumanization that it takes with children is that you forget that they're kids, that they're children, and that begins to affect how people interact with them. And so one of the things that we talk about with young people who are coming into contact with the system, particularly Black youth, Black and brown youth, is this adultification of their personhood, which enables you to interact with them in ways that are inappropriate, and that makes people forget sort of their innocence and all the kind of narrative pieces that we apply to young people and children normally, you know, that they're innocent, that they're to be protected, that they're to be cared for. This sort of adultification that happens to brown and Black youth who come into contact with the system. You know, we forget that they're vulnerable. We forget that they need nurture, that they need care. And so you see them interacting inside the system, folks interacting with these young people inside the system in ways that are harsh, that are very adult-like, with language that is inappropriate to use with children normally. All of those kinds of things begin to happen as these young people come through the system. And then, you know, so some of the language that I think is harmful is juvenile, delinquent. It doesn't really give you it really automatically kind of strips away that this is a young person, that this is a child, that this young person is under development, is in progress, the kind of impact that we can have on their brains and their spirits and their bodies. And I think one of the things we forget, and I think Johnny said this great, is that we use this term at-risk youth generally for youth that come in contact with the juvenile justice system. And what we have to start saying is that they are in risk, and begin to remove sort of that they're this kind of isolated, especially for a kid, that they're sort of this isolated, super predator criminal that's coming into the system that's bad, and instead put them into the context of what's been happening in their neighborhoods and in their environments, in their schools, that's having an impact on who they are and the choices that they're making, and that we understand them as not isolated and disconnected from these systems that are impacting them. And in many cases, like Johnny said, putting these kids in positions that is really limiting their options. And then we get to assign all the blame and strip them of them being children of God, and strip them of being children and youth for the sake of the system. And so I think that's sort of where I'll stop and pass it on to Milkar.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, a lot has been said about language, and I think that's really important to just have the discussion, because as Dean and others have mentioned, this has an impact on how we treat people. It's like it becomes part of the attitudes that we have towards certain people when we diminish their dignity and humanity. My experience, as I mentioned at the beginning, I work for this organization that work with family members who have loved ones in detention. So we see their families who come to our hospitality house and also are in a lot of distress. But visiting the people at the detention center give us another perspective of what's happening inside, because outside, we all know that immigrants are, in a way criminalized and put on under one label, and, immigrants are, criminals, or immigrants are here to commit, crimes. So that's overall generalization of who immigrants are generally. And when they are in detention, those attitudes towards them also are put in place. And kind of you see it in a different way, because in the detention center, even though this is a civil detention facility, people are placed and detained for a long time. So they are subjected to several things while they are waiting for immigration to decide about their case. Solitary confinement, I know Johnny mentioned solitary confinement. This is something that immigrants in detention face all the time. And sometimes it's just a way to let people know that, someone has the power, like a guard, someone who has the uniform has the capacity to put someone in segregation on solitary confinement, just because sometimes they complain about issues they're facing, or sometimes because they asked to be treated as a person, as a human being. And the attitudes and the reactions of the guards sometimes in those cases are, well, you are here because you're a criminal. You are here because you something you did, and that kind of gives them the authorization to actually treat them less than a person, less than a human being. So we see that all the time in the detention center, complaints that we hear from people that we visit, the people that we encounter in our visitations. There are sometimes comments that are very diminishing, harmful, and even the families who visit their loved ones are treated this way in the waiting room. They're jailed all the time by the guards. So they're not being treated as a human being, as a person. So that's something that I personally see that we encounter in general outside of the detention facility, but is also reflected in terms of what people see and is live while they are detained at the detention center. One of the other things that I think is important in terms of labeling, because we have this idea of, politicians and the media have this, play this idea of immigrants being criminal or criminalizing brown people. Those attitudes change the way how you treat people who probably just are looking for opportunities, looking for safety in this country. And some of the comments that we hear all the time is like, well, if people suffer when they are in the detention center, why they come here? Why they didn't think about the realities of people who are people who are in detention face. They're not here. They didn't come legally, and the first thing that it comes is the legal question. Like, did they come here legally? If they didn't, they should go back to their home country, and ignores the reality of the people who, in many cases, are fleeing violence, persecution, looking for safety, looking for better opportunities, and we focus only on the legality, besides starting with the compassion and how we see people as a human being. So I think that's something that we see all the time in media. For example, when it comes to the treatment of stories about immigrants, there are many cases in how news reports or outlets report about stories of immigrants who are facing detention or are in the criminal justice setting. Is the legality thing. Like, do you see normally the headlines about an immigrant living here in the United States illegally committed such and such crime? So we focus on the issue, and the position is that because they're immigrants, they're criminal, and there is no opportunity to doubt that that person might not committed that crime, or the innocent is something that we just don't presume because they're immigrants, because those labels that we have used in the past. In the immigration setting, I think that's what we're trying to change. Is we see them as a human being, as a person. Try to remove those labels, and in the detention setting, they are always called detainees, and then we just say people who are detained, people who are facing deportation. So I think those labels are important to remove, and that allow us to have now conversations about the issue, because otherwise we will just repeat what news outlets says about immigrants or politicians said about immigrants. And it is important to have the conversation and see the person as a human being. You see the person as they are, as children of God. So I leave it at that, and I invite George.
Wow, thank you, everyone. It's a little intimidating to have to go last after such great responses. However, so the first part is, what is my experience? I did mention that I spent 14 years in prison from the time I was 18 until 37, when I was released from the infamous Sing Sing prison. Is the place from where the phrase "up the river" comes from. I had spent 13 years of my life in different county jails between New Jersey and New York. I can honestly say that probably the Bergen County Jail was one of the worst, if not the worst, institutions I had ever been in. Fast forward to my time in Sing Sing, there's something about experiencing, I think, reality through metal bars. Because Sing Sing sits on this majestic Hudson River, to where our current president at one time had actually made a bid on the property because it had this beautiful, breathtaking view of the Hudson. Except when you have to look at it through metal bars, something I think happens inside of the human mind that begins to ask questions, as I did. How did my best way of thinking bring me to a place to where my community had to put me in a cage like an animal? When I got to Sing Sing, it was funny. I used to watch these movies earlier in my life, and King of New York actually takes place at Sing Sing. And it's a place where when I stretched out my hands, I could touch both sides of the cell. There was somebody else in there, 2 football lockers, a bathroom. some years later, when I was in the master's program, a group of us were reading Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. It's a book written by a gentleman who was I think, psychologist or psychiatrist who had gone through concentration camps, and he wrote his logos therapy based on that. People that gave meaning to their existence in these concentration camps got through it in better ways. And one of the things that he does is he chronicles the introduction into a concentration camp. And we all cried inside of that master's classroom because we all realized that we identified with that experience. When you get to a place like downstate, they take off all your clothes. They shackle you next to somebody. They shave off all of your hair, erase your name, and give you a number. Mine was 01A0532, which meant in 2001, I went to my reception facility was downstate, that I was the 532nd person inside of New York State prisons that year. My name did not matter anymore. It was my number. That's how I was supposed to be identified. That's what my identity was. A place like Sing Sing and other places is that they dehumanize. One of the things for prisons is that they're supposed to do 4 particular things. Number 1, supposedly retribution, deterrence, incapacitation, and rehabilitation. And as I began to go through different college programs, I began to ask myself, and we began to ask ourselves in these classrooms, if you treat us like animals and place us in a cage for a number of years and release us back into society, how are we being rehabilitated? And number 1, what if we had never been habilitated in the first place? You can't rehabilitate somebody that had never been acclimated to society and what we call or what we consider mainstream American culture. When you've been in a marginalized and experienced structural injustice for so many years growing up as a second-class citizen because of your skin color and who society says you are. So we began to reflect on our actions, and this did 2 particular things. Number 1, we felt a deep remorse. And number 2, we wanted to live better lives. And that being the case, education for me was the medium or the vehicle to do that. But I'm also haunted by the fact that, for example, a recent report came out by the crime report that almost 83% of people, those released in their study, and they looked at 400,000 people in 30 states, 83% had either committed a new crime or had gone back to prison within 9 years. Those are staggering numbers compared to Hudson Link for Higher Education, New York Theological Seminary, and the Bard College program that I graduated from. Over 98% of the people do not go back to prison. Those programs are not part of our justice system. And we also began to wonder, and I wonder myself, is what other sector of society would be acceptable if we were failing at 83% of the time? And by failing, and when we talk about recidivism rates, or the rates at which people go back to prison, statistics are just numerical representations of reality. They don't tell you the whole story. If there is committed a new crime, then guess what? There's a new victim. And so our current system is creating generations of new victims that are both victimized and become a perpetrator. And I think what society and what we've done very well is to address individual wrongs, but we don't take into consideration structural injustice. And I think the scriptures give us a way of looking at that, where we can look at the prophets where they may have not engaged in particular actions, but yet there was communal lament where they felt that because they were participated in the society, that they were also participated in the society's problems and wanted to make it better. Not so much to place blame on every individual and the entire society, but what are the ways in which we feel responsibility that if our systems are producing generations of victims and perpetrators, then maybe we have some semblance, some way of being involved, not just through our tax doctors, but also through our complicity of being quiet. Lastly, I'll just say this, that I noticed also while I was in prison, that almost every prison was outside of the range where the people came from. Almost 75 to 80% of people in New York State prisons come from one of 11 neighborhoods in the 5 boroughs, and also in Long Island. All the prisons are in rural areas in other ways, which means that the arrests, and I do say arrests, not people who committed crimes, because not everybody that goes to prison is guilty, but the number of arrests in particular communities were the economic generator in other communities where prisons produced 95% of the middle-class jobs in many areas where prisons are. And so the places where the impact of the criminal justice system was having a negative impact in certain communities, it was benefiting other communities that are dislocated from the very real issues. And then we go back to communities that are foreign to us after coming out of prison and being in a cage for so many years. My only reference point to reality was in the 1990s, and there it was 2011. And how was I supposed to reacclimate to a society when I felt like I was, number one, outside of in another planet, and number two, the felony conviction, which cements my identity in particular actions for the rest of my life. And so I always felt otherized. I never felt like I belonged anywhere, to the point to where it was very difficult reacclimating to society. Because while I've gone to Yale and everything, I would say the thing that I do today that's better than anything is I don't hurt anybody anymore. And no one I ever met inside of prison wants to come home and be a negative impact in their family, in their community, and society. But our current system is destroying people's lives at a profound rate. And if the church doesn't say something, if the church is not at the forefront or involved by putting their hand to the plow, I don't know who else is going to do it. We're in a movement right now, and throughout US history, the church has been the forefront of abolition, the forefront of civil rights. And I believe in our moment of decarceration and in mass incarceration, the church has the moral obligation. And I think the historical background and tradition of standing at the forefront of major social movements. If not the church, then who? Thank you.
Thank you, George, and thank each of you for sharing and responding to those questions. Those of you who are watching this webinar, I want to remind you that there's a question and answer feature that you can type your questions in, and we'll try to address those to either individuals or the whole panel if that's a question that you might have that you'd like each of them to address. We have a couple of other questions that we want to pose to our participants and panelists, and maybe dive a little bit deeper into some of the issues that you have addressed and raised. So we talk about language and how language affects not only our perceptions, but the way that we interact with one another and how we treat one another. And so I'm going to invite you just for a moment, and whoever wants to speak, just chime in. What are some of those labels, and what are some of those stereotypes that you'd like to see eliminated when speaking about people who've been involved with either the criminal justice system or the immigration detention system? One of the things that came to mind when Johnny was speaking and talking about solitary confinement, the first time I heard about somebody that I was visiting in a prison, and they told me that they were in administrative segregation, which didn't sound like solitary confinement to me, but that's what it was as far as the impact of that and the terminology that was utilized to in some ways modify the reality that somebody is being placed in solitary confinement. Likewise, George, you mentioned we call our prisons now correctional institutions, and what that may or may not mean with respect to the programs that are taking place and are being offered in those institutions. So I know that some of the issues that you all confront in the context in which you work give rise to a lot of these stereotypes and a lot of these labels. So which ones would you like to see changed or unpacked, or at least examined in detail, so that we can be more honest in our communications when we talk with each other, and more compassionate when we interact with other people?
Yeah, I'll take a shot at that. This is Johnny. there are two things that stick out for me. One is this notion that, most people in prison are these violent, incorrigible, individuals. And I'll tell you, in my journey, 13 years, 9 different state prisons, I can count on my hand, how many people that I sat across that I actually felt were a danger to me or even my family or even society. Most of the people that are incarcerated are people who just lack an education, who maybe come from low socioeconomic backgrounds, who have applied criminal solutions to poverty. That one piece is really strong because, if we don't see the folks inside as folks that we should be investing in, especially investing in their leadership, then we won't pass policies that allow for that. And the dehumanization continues and the oppression continues. Then the other thing that sticks out for me is this notion, and I saw it up close, of course, in prison, and then now on the policy side, when I go, and testify at public hearings and things of that nature, is that this notion that people who break the law, that criminals are born, for lack of a better term, and not, made, and if you believe that a person is born this way, then of course then no amount of reform will ever, try to convince you that we should pass. I remember going to a public hearing, and the hearing concerned bringing educational materials to the people inside of Rikers Island. And one of the things that the correction officer said, the argument was to allow these folks to have paintbrushes. And one of the things that the correction officer cited as to why people in prison, in the jail, cannot have paintbrushes was that because if we give these people paintbrushes, they'll kill and stab each other. Right. And that comes from that type of framework and that mindset where we think that, well, no matter what we do, this person is always going to revert to crime. And that's just not absolutely true. If you give me a paintbrush, I'm not going to kill someone with it. I may just become an artist or a painter, or really step into the potential of my greatness. So I would think that we should always look at the humanity in the individual, address them by their name, and not necessarily connect them to, the crime that put them in prison. I tell you, I speak to a lot of audiences around the country, and I can literally hear people thinking, when I mention, hey, I did 13 years in prison, the first thing that a lot of folks think is, I wonder what he did. And the minute that you start asking yourself, I wonder what he did, you come into a space where you're judging on whether this person should receive relief or not based on the crime that they've been convicted for. And I think that, when I think about justice and what does justice really look like, it looks like really inclusive. It looks like, love in public, for lack of a better term, or to echo, great leaders have come before me. But justice, that's what justice really looks like in public, where we invest in the capacity and the humanity of these individuals versus coming from this punishment paradigm. And the last thing is to keep in mind that we send people in this country to prison as punishment and not for punishment. And there's a very big thin line in between that, because depending on what your perspective is, then that's going to determine how you treat these folks, or even more importantly, whether you think that these folks should be released back into society in the first place.
I just have to say, well said.
Yeah, this is great, Johnny. I'm just, as I'm listening to all of us talk, I'm just thinking about this process that happens of what we do with the language. I mean, we strip humanity, and then I think, quite frankly, then we strip folks' divinity. And once we strip their humanity and their divinity, as already has been stated, then we can do whatever we want to do. And as you can imagine, this is particularly harmful to do the children and youth who have great capacity, who are still under development and growing, and need our investment, our nurture, our protection, even if they've gotten into trouble, which again, I want to keep mapping that they're in risk and not at risk. And that's connected to a host of community, systemic, and structural issues, including many of our young people that are coming into these systems, brown and Black, living in poverty, marginalization, and oppression, and then being expected to find some magical option to survive and thrive in neighborhoods that have been neglected and really designed to give disparate outcomes in every possible system in their lives and in their community. And then the other thing I would say around this language piece is that, I'm thinking about one time someone knew that I work on a local campaign that ends the criminalization of Black youth in school and policing and in the juvenile courts. And one of the newer leaders to the campaign, we went in to meet with one of the public officials in the juvenile courts, and their title is the Director of Juvenile Delinquency. And the person, the leader was like, oh my God, what a horrible name. Like that you're the director of juvenile delinquency. But it was just an example of how the language and the culture and what people call themselves who are in a system that claims to be benevolent and to rehabilitate as one of its primary tasks, that even the names of the officials and the folks that have power in these systems, it does not reflect sort of the vision of the kind of impact and the kind of treatment and the kind of love and respect that we want to show young people who are entering the system, but really signals to the kind of culture and direction that the system is headed and pointing these young people to.
Wow, thank you for that. I guess I'll chime in with some of my thoughts. During my time at Yale, one of the things that I did there is my degrees are in theology. And so for my thesis in the STM, I was working with theologian Catherine Tanner around the subject, Incarcerating the Image of God, a Political Theology of Mass Incarceration. And all that is to say is that one of the things that I found out across the Christian theological spectrum, we all believe people are created. Every person is created in the image of God. That even after what we consider the fall, that there's two things that it comprises: human dignity and human depravity. And what happened, and that kind of explains the reasons why people sometimes make certain decisions inside of their lives, and there's ways of addressing that. For example, I think the story of Cain gives us a way of thinking forward about this. In the biblical story, Cain kills his brother Abel. Afterwards, when he's given his punishment, he says it's too hard to bear. God puts a mark on him, but the mark was not meant to be a stigma for the rest of his life. But the mark was there specifically to ensure that he still had some semblance of access to human flourishing. That being said, I want to echo what Johnny said, that spaces that are prisons, part of it is the punishment. We send people to there, not for that. We don't want people continually punished, but we want people coming back into society in a way that they're assets to their communities. And I like what he said about investment, that if we're making an investment, that if our correctional system is an investment and it's failing at 83% of the time, that's not an individual problem, that's a systemic problem. That level of, that's a poor investment in terms of those terms. But back to the language. Number one, a point I just want to make is that language shapes perception and influences action. And that dehumanizing language is actually antithetical to the image of God. And I'll just give one example. In some of my research, I came across there was a debate over higher education in prison. And I will not say the name, but somebody came out with a proposal for an act called the Kids Before Cons Act. Kids Before Cons. And if we understand what when we say someone is a kid or a child, we're talking about a human child that describes a particular level of development at that time. And when we think of children, that evokes an emotional response, a parental response, a feeling that they're deserving and have particular rights that we want to protect. But yet we don't call people kids for the rest of their lives. We know that eventually they grow and develop into adults. On the con side, we're saying that the term convict is meant to be the identifying marker for somebody for the rest of their lives. and that it reduces somebody to that particular label. To the extent where, thinking of the image of God, where we uplift the depravity and never reaffirm the human dignity. And then point the finger when things don't actually go so well. So I will just give two ways I think that we can, in our language. Number one, we should use language that humanizes. And number two, that is expansive and inclusive of the greatest, and always, I think, reevaluating our particular language. Because eventually, when I went to jail, and when you're called an inmate after years and years and years and years, I think unconsciously you can begin to internalize the very dehumanization that is happening, to where you create survival mechanisms inside of a dehumanizing institution that is the exact opposite of what it means to thrive in society. And so while prisons are there is something called the decarceration movement. I'll talk about that when it comes to what the church should be involved, or what we can do in some ways of moving forward. But we should be rethinking the use of prisons as a panacea for all of society's problems, or society's perceived problems, and why we think just the exchange of time pays a societal debt, where I hurt individuals who didn't receive the type of, well, I'll leave it there, but I would say, I will say one more thing. I'm a good Baptist preacher, so I close 3 times. No, I'm only kidding. I won't do that. But I think inside of scriptures, when we look in the book of Ephesians, it says, he who stole, let him now work with his hands so he has something to give. If somebody used to lie, it says, tell them to now speak the truth. What this paradigm is showing, that maybe our system can have ways that, if you've taken a life, how can you now give life? If you've engaged in certain conditions, how can you now use your life to benefit society, not just produce an economic generator for communities? Oh, I see you're seeing my cat. And maybe we can come up with spaces where ways can be fully reacclimated back into society, have the human dignity affirmed, become assets to our communities. Because when we think of public safety, my question is, whose public are we talking about? Because the people that are coming home are our neighbors, or the people we're running into in the street, the people that are walking by us every day. And we want them coming back with their human dignity affirmed, becoming assets to society. Nobody wants to be the next victim, and from what I've met, nobody wants to be the next perpetrator either. Thank you.
I will, that's a lot. Thank you so much for that. I think it's important to go back to the language and the labels we continue to use that are the dehumanized people. And I think that's one of the, in the immigration setting and immigrants in general, that the I word, the illegal, that that's a word that is used left and right, and it means to describe, who immigrants are, and labeling, in putting like in a box. That is definitely reflected, as I mentioned in the beginning, on how people are treated when they are processed for deportation, but how people is treated in general. It's not a secret that immigrants and people of color face, hate crimes. Or people who speak Spanish, for example, are asked either at store, you should speak English because this is the United States and this is the language of the land. So all those attitudes towards immigrants are very, attack their who they are, their dignity and their humanity. So I think it'll be important for us. So if we can definitely, get rid of that label of boxing people on the label of immigrants, illegal, criminal, because that is reflected again in the policies that we see all the places that are targeting immigrants communities right now. There is 45,000 people detained today by immigration, and the main concern that immigration has is that we're protecting again, public safety. This is a public safety issue. Like we're protecting people from criminals who are on the streets, taking, in our hands the opportunity to provide safety to people. So we should secure our borders because this is a matter of protecting the people in the United States. So all those attitudes, all those labels are again transformed and put in place into policies that local government, localities, states, and the federal government put in place to target people. Recently, we have learned about the criminalization, and this is something that internationally is not a crime to cross international borders. Like it's recognized that even by the UN that if you're fleeing, if you feel unsafe or if you've been persecuted in your homeland, you can cross another border and ask for protection and ask. That's the general rule. But what we're doing right now in the United States is basically we are criminalizing everyone who comes to the United States. So what is not a crime, making it a crime. So being in a violation of immigration law, for example, is not crime, but we're making the effort, and the current administration making the effort that actually we're going to persecute you because you cross the border. Even those who are being coming to our borders for protection and asking for asylum in the United States. Recently, we learned about the separation of families at the border, and again, this is the attitude. This is in place. The policies in place on those attitudes of protecting, the United States from criminals, right? The idea that we will do this, so we will deter people to come into the United States. And again, people who are coming here are people who are facing, death threats. I'll just share a quick story of a person I visited at the detention center was working with the church in his home country, because there is so much violence and gang activity. Poor people are always targeted by the gangs, and they are basically extortionate all the time. This person was working with the church, and they had him to do some survey in the community, just trying to find out what are the things that we should do as a church to provide more safety and maybe programs for people in your community. Then he was targeted by the gangs because he was doing this work. He was approached by one of the gang members. He was with younger brother, and they basically told him, like, your family is not paying rent. You're paying rent is basically, you pay then, set up money just so you can live in your community. That's how gangs operate basically in Central America, and or you can join the gang and be part of our gang. And then they refused, of course, and then they disappeared his brother. They never found his brother. So his family didn't have any alternative but send him to the United States and ask for asylum. And he was detained for 9 months in different detention centers. And he came to Stewart, and I visited him, and I also am in contact with him. But he lost his case. He had proof that his brother was disappeared. Bishop wrote a letter, and they had, he has a lot of proof about what happened to him, his family, and the death threats that they received. And the judge just didn't believe him, and they sent him back to his homeland, and he was just afraid to go back. And he just told me, I will go back, but I'm just gonna stay hiding for a few weeks and try to, either come back here or try to go to another place because it's not safe for me. So again, we criminalizing people, put them in a detention center when they're what looking for is protection and safety. And families who are already living in the United States are being criminalized too, are being placed in detention centers, are being targeted by immigration. Immigration goes to their doors, knock their houses every time. They are in courthouses, they are in immigration check-ins, and people are placed in detention proceedings just for the reason that they were not born in the United States, and basically kidnapping them from their communities, from their family members. And now, we have, broken families, and family separation happens not only at the border where, zero tolerance was implemented, but it happens all around the United States, where immigration is doing this every day.
Thank you all. I want to follow up on this just a little bit and lead into our last question. And maybe you can incorporate some of this to your answers in the last question. But I've heard each of you refer to the folks with whom you are working, or people that you know, or even yourselves, by different language. So Deidre, you mentioned how young people who are involved in the criminal justice system are often referred to as juvenile delinquents. Amilcar, you mentioned how frequently people who are coming in seeking political asylum and are refugees and are looking for safety, that people are referring to them as illegals. We know that people who are coming out of places of incarceration, people refer to them as convicts or felons. So one, what's some different language that you would recommend people using if in fact reference to these people are made? What's more positive? What's more healthy language that we can use so that we don't demonize and stigmatize and stereotype people? And then as you're thinking about that, one of the purposes of this webinar is to inform our communities of faith of these issues that are prevalent in our communities across the country. So what advice would you give communities of faith to begin dismantling some of these negative stereotypes and images?
So I guess I'll go first, since that seems to be the order. To your first question, Dean, I would say to just say people. When you lead with the person's humanity, is very easy, and you separate the act from the person, right? So this is not a bank robber. This is a person who's convicted of bank robbery, and there's a difference there because we're not regulating this person to one chapter of their life. Let me tell you, I'm 39 years old, have a ton of accomplishments in the last 5 years that I've been released, and I still have to answer the conviction question. I still have to, try to combat this narrative that I'm going to break the law again. Whether it's with my parole officer or anyone else. So definitely, I would just suggest folks to just say people. When in doubt, use the person's name. I know that sometimes, people in correctional settings, they're actually required not to use people's names. I remember being in Arizona, at a conference about education, which is something I hold near and dear to my heart. And it turns out that, officials in Arizona are actually instructed to call people inmates, and they can't call folks by their names at all. That would be a policy that I would, of course, attack head on. But really, just call people. That works. You can't fail with that. If they're kids, say, hey, this is a kid, and really, like what Deidre said really struck about how, the adultification of kids, so where we can treat them as adults and not children, and then, of course, give them adult consequences and not age-appropriate consequences, if that, for lack of a better term. The other piece that, to your second question, I mean, there's a lot of things that, the faith community can do. But I'll say this, there's a narrative out there about me, about us, about folks who have been impacted. There's a narrative about me that has not been written by me. So how you can help me is by amplifying my voice, amplifying the work, by creating opportunities and spaces, where I'm able to share my own narrative, or we're able to share our own narrative. I think it's very important when people have the power to share their own stories, and because stories also allow us the opportunity to humanize the individual, but also to practice empathy. There's an extreme lack of empathy inside the system, and even in society when folks, return back. I'll share a quick story, and I did mention this before, but, part of the collateral consequences for me as it relates to having a criminal record is that I also have immigration consequences. I was born in Cuba, spent 10 months in Cuba before emigrating to the United States. And in my last immigration visit, here it is 5 years removed from incarceration. I've written for the top newspapers in the country. I sit on numerous boards. I've done all of that. And my immigration officer says, hey, don't break the law again. So there is this narrative about once you break the law, this is who you are forever. And that's just not true. The data shows that folks age out of crime. We can go into the numbers, but that's just not true. So by amplifying my voice and my story, and by giving me access to spaces that I may not have access to because I may lack the privilege, power, and resources that other folks do, you not only invest in my own capacity to my own leadership, but also to empower me and people like me to create more opportunities for folks in similar situations. And lastly, I'll say that the church is in a very unique position to hold people morally accountable to the values that they say they stand for. It's a different kind of thing when someone who is not from the faith community, says, hey, you should do this. And then a person from the faith community says, hey, this is what should happen or what we would like to see happen. And really owning that power and exerting it, because it's really unique to the faith community in ways in which it's not unique to other communities. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
I'll only add a couple of things. And one, I just, pick up right there, we're the people of transformation. We're the people that say we believe that people can change and be transformed and be different and be new creatures of God. Yet we don't carry sort of those theological convictions into this arena. And so it's important for us to stand up for those theological convictions, in particular in this arena. And then I think it's important for people of faith to understand the big picture of what's happening. When you link sort of these two issues, immigration, incarceration, juvenile detention, criminal reform, the United States is sort of playing both hands. You have basically, a policy of criminalizing brown and black folk. Local and domestic, just cuts different ways. If it's local, you have mass incarceration. If it's folks that are coming in, it's through these immigration policies, and without taking responsibility and accountability for our history of the kind of policies that have weakened and broken countries, kingdoms, communities into pieces and made the folks that are in these communities and in these countries vulnerable to poverty and to oppression and marginalization. So we play both sides. We criminalize on one side and we cut up on the other side and don't take responsibility for the outcomes that we've created around the world, local, domestic, and foreign. So churches have to help hold those two pieces together as the United States tries to play games and really begin to kind of say that the folks that are coming into these systems, children and youth that are coming into these systems, it's their fault. It's their lack of moral ingenuity. It's a lack of moral failure. No, it's our country's failure. It's our country's history. It's our country's tactics and strategies that have weakened and hurt people all across the world and right here in the United States. And it's our country who is criminalizing those same folks who are now trying to live with the consequences of engineered poverty and oppression.
Yeah, I will just add that I definitely agree with Johnny that just use positive language, is just call them people, right? Call immigrants as people, because even people who come to our visitation program, even sometimes people who call themselves a little liberal or in this area that really are in favor of better and more just immigration policies, continue to use the term illegal. And I think it's important to say also that there is not such a thing. There is no one is illegal. There is no human being that is illegal. That's a construction that we have, made in order to kind of validates the policies. So there is that does not exist. No one, no human being is illegal. There are criminal acts. There are criminal or there are illegal acts that we commit or people commit, but it doesn't exist. The term human beings as illegal. People cross the border illegally, but that's a different thing. Probably one of the other terms that we could use is undocumented, but that doesn't apply to everyone, because there are immigrants who are documented and still face the same things that undocumented people face in terms of detention, in terms of the attitudes, in terms of how they're treated in general. But that is a more positive way to put it. We said undocumented immigrants instead of use a very derogative term. For I think faith community are in a very unique position to be part of the change that we need in terms of how we treat the immigrant. And I think the Bible, the gospel speak greatly about being a compassionate people, that we all are children of God, that before God there's no difference between if you're black or brown, or if you're women or men. There is, before God, we are all equal. So I think there is a lot there to take into our reflection on how we treat people in general, how we treat the immigrants. The Old Testament told us the story of the people of Israel who were themselves immigrants or were slaves, and God told them, like, you know the heart of the immigrant because you were an immigrant in a foreign land. So you should not treat them. You should not oppress the immigrant. And there are so many examples. And I think it'll be important for faith communities to explore what the Bible says about immigrants, and how also Jesus called us to be compassionate. And who is our neighbor? Who is the person who is who should I go to? And himself, who lived the experience of being persecuted, or being also, according to the gospel, in a different land where he was not accepted. So I think that there is a lot there, and also give the opportunity to the church and people of faith to hear the stories, because sometimes we just made up our minds from the things that we hear on media, or the things that we read all the time, or social media, or the news. But it's important to let people have the opportunity to hear stories. So inviting people who have lived the experience of being an undocumented person, or a person who is in detention proceedings, or was in detention proceedings, immigrants who can share their stories, people who have been in different settings and can share their experience of how they've been treated in our society. So I think that's important too. In our work that we try to do is to bring people to the detention center, so people actually can meet with people who are detained, with immigrants who are facing deportation. And this is both ways to allow the people who have been placed in the detention center to receive a visitor, but also for the visitor to listen. And the role of the visitor, we always emphasize that is, you're here to listen, you're here to learn, you're here to let them talk, let them, their story, let them talk to you. And hopefully that's an opportunity that people will take themselves, and not a visit that will change people's minds and hearts. I think it's a process, and we continue to be changed by our own experience, our own work with people throughout the years, and our views have changed also about the detention. We believe that no one should be detained, no one should be incarcerated, but there are people who are in a different place right now, and we want them to have the experience of at least listening someone who is facing detention and deportation, and hopefully that's an opportunity for you to grow in the views on immigration, and do something about it, and be the change that we need for our for our communities, for our people. So I think that'll be my advice, that the church has a very unique opportunity to be part of the change, to listen to the people who are experience the pain and the suffering and the name callings, and allow them to have those experiences.
Thank you. Those were all great answers. I just want to concur with the consensus that, like what Johnny said about leading with people's humanity. One of the things is that, we're all an ex something, but nobody walks around saying, I'm an ex liar, I'm an ex this, I'm an ex fighter, I'm an ex anything like that, because that's not how we describe ourselves. That's not how we see ourselves. And also to realize that the language that we use has power, and that it has influence. That being said, some of the language that is out there now is returning citizens, but again, even as much as it tries to describe, it also limits, and further otherizes groups of people, again, that limits their whole identity, or that tries to make one aspect of somebody's life their whole identity. And we don't want that for ourselves. We wouldn't want that for other people. Also, the church, we're called to the ministry of reconciliation. And it's funny that I think Dietrich talked about, we believe that people are new creations. Well, the point about that each Christian, each person is given the ministry of reconciliation, not just the collective group, but each individual within the group, comes on the heels of being told that anyone who is in Christ is a new creation. Behold, all, not some, not many, but all things become new. And I think that the church can use its collective influence to address policy. So that leads to two things. Number one, become informed and get involved. And I just want to share a couple ways of doing that. In terms of getting involved, there is something called Prison Fellowship. It's a ministry that has not just offers programs inside of prison, but also now has an advocacy team that is actually advocating for the types of changes that we've been talking about today. And one of the things they do is they send people into churches to host for Second Chance Month, and also to become what are called the justice advocates. That creates a groundswell of, or uses the collective influence and impact to address policy change. Number two, there's something called healing communities. Healing communities is a way that, because many churches that I've gone to, they want to do something, they just don't know what to do. And I think that we can apply best practices to when it comes to prison ministry and reform inside of our churches. Some best practices is that there's already groups and organizations that are doing the work, like some of the people on this panel that work for particular organizations, partnering with them, having people coming and speaking at your churches is what was said. But also think about creating your own prison ministry and then working with other ministries that are already doing it and partnering maybe with other churches and other particular ministries to have a collective impact. In terms of staying informed, there's something called Right on Crime, which is a conservative group that was actually created by the Texas Public Policy Foundation and Prison Fellowship that has a fairly, I would say, progressive agenda. I don't know if Dean knows this, but he and I met in Washington, D.C. when we were actually advocating for, we were on a panel in the House and the Senate. We were advocating for the Sentencing Reform Act. That act was actually created by Right on Crime members in conjunction with Prison Fellowship. Also, there's something called the Sentencing Project that offers a wide range of data concerning the criminal justice system. And something out of Washington University, out of St. Louis, the Smart Decarceration Initiative. It offers, or it aims to build social capacity to reduce incarceration rates in ways that are effective, sustainable, and socially just. I'll provide that information for anyone that wants it and wants to get involved. And lastly, the church is mandated in Matthew 25, and one of the things that those who claim to know Jesus and love him and want to follow him are told that how did they treat those who were homeless? How did they treat those who were sick? How did they treat those who were in prison? I've heard one person say, one minister say, and I'm not going to go that far, but he said, if you don't have a prison, and the question we have to ask ourselves is, according to those criteria, what would Jesus say about me? What would Jesus say about our church? And I think that we can use that as a motivating factor to stay informed and to get involved. God bless you.
Thank you, George, and thank each of you for taking time out of your busy lives to participate in this this important panel. This is going to be it's been recorded, and it'll be placed on the National Benevolent Association and the Reconciliation Ministries of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ webpage. We're hoping that if folks haven't been able to be here for the live video, that they will access this and bring it back to their churches, and hopefully it will generate some good conversation as we try to move everyone toward this place of reconciliation as we seek to create the kingdom of God and bring people to places of healing and wholeness. I want to once again thank you all for being part of this. I'm going to call on April and Barry to come back and offer some concluding comments as we end this webinar.
Well, thank you, Dean. And I'd like to add my thanks to Johnny and to Deetra and to Amilcar and to George. Thank you so much for sharing one so authentically, and for putting us in the place, in the space of what it means to be impacted by and confined by the criminal justice system, as well as opening our hearts to ways in which we can, as people of faith, be involved in the process and act of reconciliation, and more importantly, the process of liberation. I'm grateful for your nod to the ways in which education is a part of liberation. So I give you thanks for that, and I hope that this webinar, for all of the those who have participated, have found this as rich as I have, a rich educational process. And I hope that you will share the recording with friends and folks that you know that may not have been able to participate today, because this was very informative and very necessary. As you heard, labels diminish all of us. So not some of us, but all of us. And I also heard repeatedly through each of our participants, our panelists, that humanization is the act of recognizing ourselves and each other as children of God. And as George said, if the church doesn't do it, then who will? Our youth are depending on us. So as the racial and social justice witness of our denomination, thank you, George, for that nod, reconciliation has been entrusted to all of us. So Reconciliation Ministry's goal is to accompany and to help you interpret opportunities to embrace God's call to do, to love, and to walk with each other as we see and meet God in each other. And as this webinar was entitled, Beyond the Labels. So we hope this webinar has provided you the opportunity to learn something new, to meet some new people and make new connections. And most importantly, it's our desire that this webinar compels you to do something new. For what does the Lord require of each of us but to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God? So I want to just leave you all with these simple key takeaways. If you weren't taking copious notes, which I hope you were, thank God this was recorded. I want you to at least have these 4 takeaways that we have here on the screen, so that you can have something to share with, to remember first off, but to share with folks who couldn't participate in this. It is so important that we remember how all of us are conscripted into a narrative that makes everybody other, and that all that does is diminish us as well as those who we put labels on, particularly negative labels on. And so we want to make sure that we give ourselves the opportunity to walk with folks who have been impacted by the criminal justice system in ways that are authentic. And so I hope these 4 takeaways in this webinar has been helpful. And thank you again so much for participating. And again, thanks so much for the partnership with NBA. We really appreciate NBA Prison and Jail Ministries in particular, but we really appreciate your partnership in sharing this webinar opportunity for our church and for folks who will have the opportunity to see the recording. Blessings and peace to all of you.
Thank you for having me. Thanks, everyone.
All right.
That concludes.
Goodbye, everyone.
I want to thank everyone for their participation. Blessings to each of you in your ministry and in your work. And may we bring this message to a wider audience so that we can become the change that we hope to be. God bless you.
Thank you, Dean.
Thanks, everyone.
All right. Blessings all.